Well, after a fabulous summer of sailing, we are now safely locked up in the turf locks. One of the most important jobs to do, and sooner rather than later, is an oil change and oil filter change. Over the summer period, all the oil has been contaminated from mild moisture, chemical reactions, possibly even minor diesel and coke in there, so your oil is very contaminated now. You do not want this sitting in your sump all winter and causing corrosion problems. While you're servicing your engine, it's also important to change the impeller, fuel filters and also your oil filter. In this episode I'm going to go quickly through the method of changing your oil and filters. The engine on my boat is a Beta Marine 28. This is an old engine which has done around about 3,500 hours but still runs wonderfully. When I spoke to Beta Marine with concerns over the hours of the engine, they mentioned to me that if it's been well maintained and regular oil changes, there will be no real issues and need for a rebuild until round about 10,000 hours. An oil change is much easier to do if the engine is warmed up. This tends to make the oil much thinner and easier to pump out. Before starting the engine, it's really important to take out your water filter that cools the engine. This one, being in a canal, clogs up really easy with external weed, so you don't want to overheat your engine. Time to warm up the engine. As you can see here, I've got an issue with the tacho not reading and showing. So after running the engine for a little bit, it's switch off. Now the engine is warm, not hot. One of the great conversions on this engine is a hand pump that is connected directly to the sump. This makes oil changing so easy. On my oil filter, I also like to put a sticker on with the date that I changed the oil and filter. This just helps me. I also put it down in my maintenance log. Next stage is just topping up with a good quality oil. Always look at the recommendation of your manufacturers. Don't use cheap oil. Once you've put the recommended amount of the correct oil in, it's a simple matter of checking your dipstick, run the engine for a little bit and recheck your dipstick. Do this a couple of times, as the oil level will change as the engine runs and starts to fill up your probably empty oil filter. Once you've started and run your engine, go and check your oil pressure. Unfortunately, my oil pressure gauge has broken, but this is under repair. Now that the oil change is completed, it's time to do the fuel filters. There are two on this particular boat. My first fuel filter is mounted externally on the engine wall. This is a simple matter of a 10mm spanner on the top to undo and lower the oil filter off. I was quite surprised to see an unusual amount of sticky tar-like crud in the bottom of this particular filter, which was cleaned out. If any of you have got any ideas about what this is, please leave me a comment below. The fuel filter comes with replacement O-rings and oil seals. Make sure you put a new ring on both top and bottom of the bolt, as well as a new seal on the filter, and always put a little bit of marine grease on. This helps with removal. The fuel filter back in place and nipped up again with the 10mm socket. Do not over tighten them. Release the drain plug that's underneath the oil filter and then start priming until eventually you get a little bit of oil just dribbling out the bottom of that. That gets rid of all the air gaps in the first filter. Removal of the second filter, which is on the side of the engine. Previously, when I changed this filter, I'd put a little smear of grease on the rubber O-ring. This makes it so much easier to disassemble on your service. The new fuel filter ready to go on with a greased and new O-ring. Simply tighten the oil filter up by hand, no need to use any tools to tighten on a fuel filter. All filters now replaced, it's now time for that dreaded bleeding the diesel system. I find by removing this bolt on the top, which is sealed with a copper washer, I can use this to put a vacuum on to help draw through the oil. Apply the vacuum to the top of the secondary fuel filter until you start seeing a little bit of oil going into the pipe. With the bolt replaced, you can now start turning the engine over to prime the injector. Start by loosening one of the injectors, the brass bolt on this one, and then turning the engine over. When you're turning the engine over, don't keep hammering your starter motor. Keep giving a little break each time so you don't get an overheating starter motor. Here, whilst turning over the motor, you can start to see diesel coming out of the rear injector. Simply repeat this for the other injectors on your boat. Once all bled, let the engine run for a couple of minutes to take out any micro bubbles in the system. Another important service point is replacing the impeller. It can be seen here behind this brass plate containing 6 screws. Simply remove the plate. A good safety procedure here is to make sure your seacock to cooling system is off. 2 pairs of long nose pliers should help you just pull the impeller out. This photograph shows an impeller covering with an O-ring. On the Beta 28, which is on my engine, it's a paper gasket. Make sure the paper gasket goes back on, or a new O-ring if you have an O-ring on your boat. You can see here the difference between a good impeller and a bad impeller. Impellers over time tend to go hard and they will crack. The little rubber pieces then start going into engine, and that's a major cooling problem, so replace them every year and also have a spare. The housing with a new impeller in place, ready for the faceplate. Another important job is replacement of the sacrificial anodes that are on the heat exchanger. Drain off your old coolant and replace it with the correct amount of antifreeze for the winter. You'll get much more life out of your sails if you can take them off for the winter and store them somewhere dry and fold them up. Don't put your sails away if they're damp. This will just cause mould and mildew over the winter. Try to keep your diesel tanks topped up over the winter. This reduces the gaps for condensation to build up if there's no air in there. Also very important as well to add some diesel bug treatment to try and stop all those horrible bugs and slime building up in both your tank and your pipe feeds. I hope you found this video useful. If you've got any tips on top of this, please leave them in the comments. I've since fixed the problem with the oil pressure gauge not reading. This turned out to be a bad oil pressure sender. Simple change. The rev counter or tacho didn't turn out to be so simple. In the end it was a need for a replacement tachometer, but that's all working again now, so woohoo! Roll on the spring when we can get sailing. See you next time.